Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. I'm Bob Sessions, your moderator this morning for Ethical Perspectives on the News. The topic we're going to be talking about today is usually not considered to be much of a moral issue for people, but I think you'll be surprised. It's not one of those huge issues, but it's one that is at the ground level of our society, and that is tipping. Why is tipping a moral issue? Well, it's because there are some people that work in service industries who don't get tips. I'm sure you all know, if you've been in situations where you have been in a hotel, for example, you don't know whether to tip or how much to tip, or what about that bartender, or what about your car mechanic. There are a lot of people in the service industry who aren't directly in the tipping flow, if you will, but certainly it seems like the restaurant industry is a place where tipping is universal and pretty clear how that works. But unfortunately, that isn't entirely true either, and there's a lot of controversy about this. People who get tips in restaurants, the waiters, do not get paid minimum wage. They get paid quite a bit less, $2 and what? I've forgotten exactly how much.
In the state of Iowa, it's 60% of minimum wage.
60% of minimum wage.
So it's higher in Johnson County than it is here.
Okay. And so they have to make up to even get minimum wage by getting tips. Well, some people tip well and some people don't. How much is a good tip? Is it 10%, 15%? Now some people are saying it's 25%. These are difficult issues, and underneath all of that, we're trying to figure out how to make sure that the people doing these jobs in the service industry, which we all appreciate and need, get a fair living wage. And if you depend on tips, yes, your tip depends at least in part on how well you perform your service, but it also depends on the mood of the customer, the quality of the food of the restaurant you happen to be working in, and so on. And you may get shortchanged compared to people working elsewhere. So there's some really serious issues here. What to do about it? There are some restaurants that have tried, in fact whole states that have tried, or cities, to do away with tipping and simply raise the wage so everybody makes the same. What happens is apparently that doesn't work because other restaurants don't do that. And people look at the prices of the non-tipping restaurants and they're having to charge more because they're now paying their people more. And so people say, well, that food's too expensive, even though if you do the math, probably you're not paying any more or sometimes not as much for the, if you pay the tip as well. So this is a complicated issue. I think it's really important to understand that at base, this issue is part of a larger conversation about how can we be fair to people who are working class people. When we've got people in our society making millions, in some cases billions of dollars a year, and there are a lot of working people who are working very hard, just as hard often probably as the millionaires, and they're having to work a couple of jobs, or even in some cases 3 jobs, just to make ends meet. So this is a part of a much larger issue. We have 3 really qualified and very good people to help us this morning. To my immediate left is Kurt Friese, who is the owner and chef at Devotee Restaurant in Iowa City. Next to him is Rick Moyle, who is the executive director of the Hawkeye Labor Council. And finally, on the end, we have Nate Willems, who is an attorney with Rush and Nicholson. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Let's start by each giving your perspective on the situation. What is it like for people in the service industry, in particular in restaurants?
Well, in my restaurant, which is very small in downtown Iowa City, there's only 45 seats. My staff, front of house staff, earns on average, a lot of variables involved, but on average they make between $20 and $25 an hour. Mm-hmm. That's because we're a good restaurant. Our prices are higher than McDonald's. We don't have diner prices, and their tips are figured by each individual guest based on the bottom line of the check. And since we do our job pretty well, they usually make out okay. Mm-hmm. I've looked at a number of different models for how to change that, how to go to an hourly wage. There's an awful lot about it that seems fairer when you think about it. But if I were to try to match their what they're currently making with an hourly salary, I'd be asking you to pay $45 for a chicken entree, and I don't think you're going to be willing to do that. Or, as you were saying before, if we could get people to understand that you're not having to pay a tip, that's a hard lesson to do. I'd have to change the name of the restaurant to No Tipping Restaurant or something like that.
Okay. So what about the people, who aren't on the wait staff? They make a lot less than $25 an hour.
Most of the time they do. So some of my staff's been with me a long time, and their wages have gotten up there. But most typical starting wage of a prep cook, for example, in Iowa City, is just barely north of $10 an hour, because Johnson County is lifting its minimum wage gradually. So there's almost nobody in the restaurant business that pays minimum wage for much of anything anymore.
Okay. Rick, what's your perspective on this?
Well, labor's perspective on any time when it comes to a wage, and in this case it would be wages plus tipping, would be that we need to realize that these folks that are working are doing us a service. So tipping is perfectly okay. There are some questions about the equalness when it comes to from one restaurant to another restaurant to another type of service business, how those tips are distributed. Tip pooling would be one thing. I'm not sure if you guys do that, if that's allowed there. I'm not sure, if your particular restaurant or how many even statistically in the area, as far as backline folks, your cooks and your dishwashers, are they ever allowed to receive a portion of tips from one of the waitresses, if they would ever be allowed to do that? I mean, it seems like to me there's so many different variables and so many different situations that it's really hard to determine what is fair and what is just to that employee.
Yeah. Nick?
Well, outside of the restaurant business, whether a person is salaried or hourly, most of the time you get a paycheck with a pay stub, and it says right there how much I am making, how many hours I put in, or just a kind of a flat amount if you're salaried. And it's just not quite so simple typically in the restaurant business. And so from my perspective, whenever something gets more complicated, whenever it's less obvious to an employee exactly how I'm getting paid, that's when there's more potential for abuse, for the laws to not be followed.
Yeah. So you think that if we could figure out how to do it, getting rid of tips might be a good idea? Just because of the complications it creates?
I think that, I don't know if that's necessarily the answer, but I mean, I think that a worker really has a right to know precisely how and why they're getting paid. I mean, sometimes, in other areas we see where some employers have gone away from handing you a physical pay stub to, well, there's a website you can go to look and see your pay stub, and that kind of sometimes raises red flags. Anytime you're putting an extra hurdle in for somebody in order to figure out what they're making, it raises red flags in my mind. And so, take that into the restaurant scenario. I mean, the more transparent an employer can be, and the easier it is for an employee to understand their paycheck, I just think it's a better solution for everybody.
I've been hearing some sort of disturbing things about some restaurants, especially major chains and so on, that instead of doing paychecks at all, they've got debit cards, yes. Actual, with a MasterCard or Visa logo on it, and your pay is simply charged, thrown onto that card. There's a lot of problems with that, as far as I'm concerned, including the various fees that they charge
yes.
their employees for
Absolutely.
these things. I don't think those things should be allowed at all. I'm not sure where the law stands on them right now, but they shouldn't be permitted.
Well, one of the things I think you want is for the employees to feel good about how they're doing relative to the other employees in a given situation. It seemed to me the suggestion that Rick made about pooling, if it went to a vote of the employees, I would think many of the wait staff would be happy to let everybody else share in those goods, because after all, everybody's producing that experience for the consumer.
And it creates a better team atmosphere as well. And in regards to tipping out the kitchen, my servers are not required in any sense to do that, but they all do it anyway. And it's not a great deal of money. It's a few bucks each. The cooks usually refer to it as beer money, but it's helpful, and it keeps the camaraderie going pretty well. They work well together, and I think we have such a small restaurant though that our dynamic is a little different than some places.
And just to clarify, the law says that if you're going to have a tip pool, you can require a tip pool tips to be pooled and shared amongst types of employees that customarily are going to get tips. But you couldn't require waiters or waitresses to share tips with people who are theoretically, just straight hourly employees who are not going to get tips, and you couldn't have to share with managers.
Right. That'd be nice if they did, but
how did we get to this situation? I mean, in so many other service areas, like I mentioned, car mechanics and so on, tips are not common. They're not expected. Why did we start doing this? I mean, I think one argument might be the quality of service, but I want my car mechanic to have quality service too, but I don't want to tip him. He charges $50 an hour, okay?
That I've been able to find the true origins of this tradition are sort of lost to the mists of time. They taught us back in culinary school that tips was an abbreviation for to ensure proper service, or prompt service. And I don't know how true that is. I think it's probably a little apocryphal, but it has certainly become ingrained in our society, at least in terms of full-service restaurants, and not for some reason in terms of McDonald's, any place where you walk up to the counter and get your food. Why there's such a difference there, because the server takes a few extra steps, I'm not sure. Mystery, there's more to table service than that, but why the ethic, the ethos around this has gone that way, I think I'm not sure anybody knows.
Well, the law was written in the 1930s, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and so I'm sure that I have to believe that kind of the cultural values or expectations of that point in time, for example, like agricultural workers are exempted from it entirely, this sort of thing would have gone into why people were carved out or treated differently in the statute.
I think for me, I want to kind of back up a little bit. I think for me, it's more important to know where that tip money is going when I do tip. And I think a lot of folks take for granted that if I leave a tip, that waitress or that waiter is automatically going to receive that money. I know that there's many cases now out there where if you have a party of 6 or larger, it's automatically 18-20% gratuity added to your bill. As far from anything that I've looked up or found in Iowa anyway, the restaurant is not required to give that or any portion of that money to the staff. So I think that
really,
that's
all this money I've been missing out.
Which I'm sure that it does happen, and then it rolls into another thing that we like to call wage theft, which we do believe that is a portion of wage theft. So it is important if you're out there eating in restaurants or whatever you're doing, it's okay to ask that waitress or that waiter, now if I leave you a tip, are you getting this tip? Are you receiving this? If I pay with a credit card, and I don't think a lot of the employees of the restaurants even know the ins and outs of it or what they're supposed to get or not get, and I think that's a major issue. It's a problem. So we need to educate the folks in our communities, as well as the owners of the businesses, as well as the folks that are patronizing those places.
How do we police that situation? I mean, that's because wage theft is real in a lot of places. Certainly agriculture is infamous for the wage theft that's been going on there.
Well, the less you have paper records, the more it is a cash business, the harder it is to enforce. Whether it's cash or whether it's a credit card being run and being cashed out at the end of the night. it's just harder to document abuse as opposed to a more traditional workplace setting.
Well, what if we combine two things? What if we had a requirement that anybody serving is paid a minimum wage, whatever that is, $10, $15 an hour and so on, and hopefully become a living wage. And then if you wanted to tip, you could add to that. But that way, nobody's going to fall through the cracks and have abuse and not make a wage and so on.
That's something I could get behind as long as it was mandated. If I'm
Right.
paying my staff twice or three times what the restaurant across the street is paying, well, my servers are going to be pretty happy about that, but my prices are going to be so high that nobody's going to come in.
Sure.
So unless it's true across the board,
Yeah. Well, that's the way the law functions in a lot of places. I mean, companies complain about environmental protection laws, for example, but it's fine as long as everybody has to meet the same standard. If you just pick on one company, then obviously that's going to be a problem. So it seems to me that's one way to go. Has this come up at all that you know in the legislature, or is there a group, a labor group that's pushing for some changes in the law?
there's Rock United.
As far as raising the minimum wage, the fight for 15, SEIU was big in that, and still are, and other organizations that are pushing for that. It seemed like that was more focused on your, not limited to, but more of a focus on your fast food restaurants, where pay inequality is something that's even higher than the average pay inequality for other services. When you have a CEO of McDonald's making 380 times what the average employee makes, that's going to throw up some red flags. And of course, there are going to be labor groups and other organizations that like to see fairness. They're going to stand up and holler about that, and they're going to say there's not a reason why we can't raise this minimum wage.
And I mean, the state of Iowa tends to be a step or two behind many of our peers when it comes to having substantive state laws to give worker protections. Iowa does not even have an overtime law. It's only a federal law that a worker can rely on. Minnesota, because of the potential for abuse and tip pooling situations, I believe it's prohibited in Minnesota. It's certainly not in Iowa. Some of the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of not having to give a paper pay stub or these sorts of things have been built into Iowa law. So the protections, just as a general proposition, we're typically a step behind other states in real substantive or procedural protections for workers.
One of the other organizations that deserves mentioning is Rock United, Restaurant Opportunity Center United, who's been working specifically in restaurants for fair pay and against wage theft and that sort of thing. And I tend to be something of a strange bird because I'm a member of that organization, and I also sit on the state board of the Iowa Restaurant Association. These two organizations don't like each other very much.
There has been legislation the past two sessions that has, it didn't go anywhere in regards to wage theft, adding some levels of penalties to that for being convicted of wage theft, and I believe it's only one. They figure there's only one person for the state of Iowa monitoring or investigating wage theft. And when you look at the number of employees in the state of Iowa, that would tell me that hey, state legislature, it's time to do something.
Yeah.
So.
There was a case of it in North Liberty just this past spring. There was another one at the steakhouse in Coralville last year or the year before. It happens all over the place.
But I mean, in terms of kind of cultural expectations with tipping, kind of our cultural expectations with enforcement of these issues has not been reliance on the government. Though certainly, I believe a county attorney could prosecute under the theft statutes people guilty of this type of crime, but it's just not something that we really expect our law to be. We don't even think of it as a law enforcement matter.
Including the servers themselves, the ones that are getting
Right.
ripped off, don't think of it as a law enforcement matter. They just think of it as getting screwed.
Well, given these difficulties, I'm just not familiar with this at all. What is the turnover rate? Is it as high with restaurant workers as it is with other low-wage workers, or is it higher?
In the restaurant industry as a whole, turnover is very high.
Is it?
My restaurant is a bit of an exception. I've got people with me there 7, 9, 11, 14 years. That's crazy in the restaurant business. But for the most part, a line cook is considered a veteran if he's been there for a year.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. Does that make it more difficult to get some kind of concerted action? Because these people aren't there long enough to
And in Johnson County
bring
especially,
forth
'cause-
suit and so on?
In Iowa City especially too, because it's such a transient
Students.
town and it's all students all the time. So servers, some of the abuse they find is because we've got owners who think that servers are a dime a dozen, and if you quit on me, I'll just get another one look just like you.
Well, and, I mean, the single biggest factor there is in the restaurant industry, like most industries, the vast majority of people are at-will employees, meaning they can be fired at any time for good reason, bad reason, or no reason whatsoever, so long as it's not an illegal reason. And yes, it's absolutely illegal to terminate somebody in retaliation for them making a wage complaint. But, I mean, workers realize this is the world, that the reality is not always the same.
Yeah, and our answer would be to at-will employment. There is a way to give yourself a little bit of security, and that is to organize. That is to organize, join a union, and have a collective bargaining agreement, so that these things would not necessarily be as easy to happen to you, as far as wage theft and wrongful termination, et cetera, et cetera.
Why do you think it is? There's only been, let me see, to my knowledge, the only cities in America that are strongly union in the food service industry are Chicago, Cincinnati, and Las Vegas. Are there others? New York has some.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure why that is, but I do believe that it is extremely hard to organize a fast food restaurant in the Midwest or in this area, or a regular sit-down restaurant or diner, because of what you were just speaking of a little bit ago, and that's the turnover rate. It's a higher turnover, but the turnover would be much less too if it was a better work environment,
were unionized.
which goes hand in hand with being organized.
Right.
I have a kind of a personal connection. I have a son who's going to law school this fall, but for the last year he's been between college and law school out in Oregon, and he was working at a restaurant as a line chef in the university in Portland. And he got more and more involved and got to know the people and so on. And particular incident where one of the workers was being asked to do things that were harmful to him, and they didn't provide safety and so on. And so my son went to bat for that person, and he ended up being ushered out the door. I mean, that kind of thing, I'm sure, is common when people stand up for themselves.
If he had a union standing behind him, it wouldn't have happened.
Well, he was a member of the union.
Really?
Okay, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
You've got some brothers you need to talk to, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a hard. I mean, this really does sound more and more like the situation for, migrant farm workers.
Well, in some cases, it's exactly the same situation.
Yeah.
There's, a lot of the obviously farm workers and meat packers and that sort of work is where a lot of the undocumented workers are, but probably ranking third place, and that would be food service. There's an awful lot of them.
I hope people take this to mind as we're talking to them this morning, that be kind to your servers, and be sure that you're going to a place that treats your people well. I think that's a really important lesson from this conversation.
Especially be generous to breakfast servers who work twice as hard for checks that are half as big. So keep that in mind when you're figuring out the tips that you're doing for people.
Yeah. The more expensive the meal, the less the tip.
Well, when it's as cheap as breakfast and it goes really fast, it's high volume, they got to get this stuff out there, and they're doing more than a dinner server for less money.
Well, Well, I think it's important to sort of get some money on the board. I talked to a man who was a chef for 35 years a couple days ago. Wonderful man. He's worked in a lot of different restaurants, and he's handicapped now, so he can't do that anymore. But he said that all the years he worked as a chef, the most he ever brought in was $35,000. Okay? And he said he was never in a restaurant where the backstage staff made as much as the front stage staff.
I never have been either. And his estimate of the income is probably pretty accurate. The TV shows that we've had in the last 10 or 20 years have made the work appear quite glamorous,
yeah.
but it isn't really.
It's hard work.
It is.
Yeah, yeah, that's important. Yeah, we just have a couple minutes. You guys have other issues that you want to raise? I mean, this is, I could say, a minefield. There's so many different aspects to it.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd say that you know, our wage and hour laws are some of the simplest laws that we have. If you work, you've got a right to get paid. But they're also some of the most often violated laws that we have. I mean, in every type of work setting. And when you add kind of the aspect of perhaps not documenting, not having a clear documentation of time and work, it just adds for the potential for greater abuse and for people to get shortchanged. Yeah. And that's, you know, I would certainly like to see, you know, that every employee has, to make it as simple as possible for them to know what they're getting paid for.
I'd say the one last piece of tipping advice I could give people is to think about when you're at a restaurant and you're getting an early bird special or 2 for 1 at happy hour or something like that, to bear in mind that this means that server is working higher volume, and once again their bottom line that you're figuring your 20% out of, or 15% or whatever you're willing to pay, that total is lower because even though they're working harder. So it's a kind thing to do, to figure out what the actual bill would have been had you not gotten that special deal that the manager put in place, and tip the server based on that.
Don't you think, in a sense, that the tipping system works against people actually being treated fairly? Because it looks like generosity. Oh, we're giving you this. I mean, isn't that part of the problem?
It can certainly come across that way. It kind of depends on which side of it you're on.
And I think it's important that folks realize that a lot of these employees who, it's a misconception that a lot of these folks are just high school kids making extra cash.
Yeah.
A lot of these folks nowadays are folks that are trying to raise a family and are actually bringing in over 50% of the average household income. And I think you need to keep that in mind when you were thinking about tipping as well. It's not just a high school kid making extra cash.
Indeed.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This has been, I think, very helpful. I hope everyone who's been listening this morning learned some things. I certainly have. I want to thank Kurt Friese and Rick Moynes and Willems for joining us this morning. Very good conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope we got to the right issues.